With preseason testing done of the 2025 Formula One season, we have a pretty good idea of where the teams are looking in their pecking order of performance to begin the year. Now, I previously did some of my way too early predictions for the 2025 season, but now that we have a bit more of an idea of the pecking order going into the season, let's do a review of those predictions, and I'll give you some updated predictions for the Constructors Championship. So let's get into it. Hello everybody, my name is Michael, and welcome back to Last to First. So kicking things off in P10 for my 2025 season predictions, I've got to go with Sauber. Sauber just seemed to have made no progress relative to the others after preseason testing. The car looked comfortably the slowest, and it just seems like they have a long way to go. While 2026 is when things get properly important for them because Audi is taking over, it's still important for them to get the most out of 2025 because the same processes and same workflows, same managerial styles, everything that will be there in 2026 is going to be there now in 2025. I've heard that the focus on 2026 has potentially been a big reason for their struggles as of late. It seems like they're a bit too focused on 2026 and just not putting enough energy into 2025. The more they struggle now, the longer it's going to take them to get out of the hole, even as Audi. Just because there's a name change doesn't mean there's going to be a significant performance change. Sauber don't necessarily need to be climbing up the performance order, this year. They just need to show steady, stable progress throughout the year and show that they can make some developments throughout the year so that they can have a better platform to build on in 2026 and beyond. In ninth, I had Racing Bulls, and I had previously predicted Racing Bulls would be in ninth at the end of the year. Despite them looking maybe a little better than ninth in preseason testing, I still just think over the course of the season, they are going to be behind other teams. The fact of the matter is that they do have a lower ceiling than most of the other teams because of their reliance on Red Bull. They can only achieve so much in the sport because they're getting their parts from Red Bull, and they're getting more and more of those parts from Red Bull, which normally would be kind of an automatic increase in performance, but Red Bull seems to be a bit of a challenging car right now and seems to be on a bit of a kind of backwards trend right now, so that won't necessarily be helping Racing Bulls anyway. Racing Bulls has been one of those teams that has just consistently fallen into development traps throughout the year, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen again this year and really drop them down the order. If they were able to more consistently develop the car, then they probably could fight a bit higher up the championship. But if we go based off of times like last year, they have been struggling a bit. Racing Bulls is just so difficult to get excited about. Like, they just don't even have their own team identity. They're just this thing that exists in Formula One with no real purpose other than to serve Red Bull with some drivers, and even then most times they don't even take drivers from that team. So it's difficult to get excited about Racing Bulls. Their ceiling is not as high as the other teams, and just seems like their existence is a little pointless. But they probably, along with Haas, should be really at the bottom of the field, but some other teams like Sauber are really underperforming right now, so I at least have Racing Bulls in ninth. Now, speaking of underperforming, in P8 I have Aston Martin, and previously I had Williams in P8. Aston Martin have shown after these past few years that they can't develop a car throughout the season to save their life. They've had obviously great starts to the season to make their overall seasons look better than what they ended up with, but this year they seem to be starting off bad, which is not good since they haven't been able to consistently develop a car. Aston right now is kind of a less extreme example of Sauber and somewhat an example of Williams as well, and that's because their focus is really on 2026, and while their focus might be on 2026 where the pieces really start to come together for them, they still do need to get more out of this year. Now, Aston Martin is in a bit of a better position than maybe Williams and Sauber are currently in because they have been making these investments so long and they have a lot of new things that are starting in 2026. They still need to get the most out of 2025. Like with Sauber, all of their same processes and workflows are going to be transitioning from 2025 to 2026, so they do need to make those changes now to help them in the future. Like with Sauber, they don't necessarily need to be the absolute quickest, but they do need to show that they can develop a car and have a progressively good season, not just a good winter. In P7, I have Haas, and once again, I feel like they really don't have any business being that high up the order, but a lot of these other teams are just underperforming. I previously predicted Aston Martin in 7th. I didn't think they would have a good year, but they are seemingly struggling already. But back to Haas, under the leadership of Io Komatsu after last year, I really have no reason to think that Haas won't have another decent year this year. I just think the other teams have higher ceilings, like Racing Bulls. The Haas setup is just inherently limited and creates a lower ceiling than some of the other teams. They get so many parts from Ferrari and are just underfunded because Gene Haas just refuses to invest anything in that team. He wants to win in a tin can versus building a Formula One car, but that's another rant for another day. But now that some of the other teams like Williams and Alpine are starting to get their act a bit more together, I think it's going to be a tough ask for Haas to be ahead of some of these other teams when they are operating with a higher ceiling and just getting more out of their cars. So I don't think Haas will have a particularly bad year. I think it's just going to be tough for them to get higher up the grid as some of these other teams start to perform a bit better, like maybe Williams, Alpine, and the other teams. In P6, I have Alpine, and I previously predicted that Haas would be in P6. I had Alpine as really the dark horse of the season, and I still think that they could be, but Williams maybe is even more of a dark horse and has me a bit more excited. It's also just hard to have faith in Alpine over the course of the season given their track record over these years, so having them too high up the grid is a bit of a tall ask. But after preseason testing, they do seem to be comfortably kind of in their own zone with Williams, kind of behind the top 4 but ahead of the rest of the grid, so I have no reason to think that they won't be pretty decent this year. The problem with Alpine is there's just always so much happening with that team. Between the likelihood of them getting sold, them having a rookie, the constant noise of Doohan being replaced by Colapinto, I just think that even if they do have a faster car than Williams, they won't maximize it nearly as much as maybe Williams will, as well as just not having quite the same driver pairing as Williams does. So overall, I could see Alpine having a pretty decent year. I just think that maybe there's another team in that midfield that's going to do a little better. Speaking of that team, in P5, I have Williams, and previously I had Alpine in P5 and Williams a bit further down the order. I was already pretty hyped about Williams because of James Vowles and Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon, but now I am really starting to fully believe in that project like a lot of people clearly are. Prior to preseason testing, I thought that they would be a bit lower just because they still are a growing team and, they are still trying to crawl out of the depths that they were in, and they said so much of their focus is on 2026 like for many of the other teams. But they, as opposed to Sauber, are trying to improve now, make the most of now, and set themselves up for a better 2026. And I think they're doing that nicely. And, they're seemingly going to be able to make some performance gains this year, despite having a real primary focus on 2026. Overall, I just have way more faith in Williams and the James Vowles project than Alpine in sixth. I think they're going to be able to string together, more of a full season. I have more faith in the drivers as well at Williams. Just having 2 incredible drivers is really going to propel them up in the order and allow them to score points consistently. And I think it's going to be a great year for Williams in P5. I don't think they'll necessarily be fighting into the top 4, but it does seem like they are going to be kind of in their own zone with Alpine. In P4, I have Red Bull, and previously I had predicted that it would be Mercedes. Now, people have been writing Red Bull and Verstappen off even before preseason testing, but even after preseason testing, I feel like we can't write them off. It's a pretty dangerous game to write them off. They don't look particularly strong, but they are going to be there or thereabouts, no doubt about that. I just don't see a world where Verstappen and Red Bull aren't title challengers this year, but it doesn't look like they're going to have that beginning of the season advantage like they did in 2024. But despite all that, even though I think it will be very close, Red Bull do need to make a big step because it is looking like McLaren are the ones that are the strongest and have the best understanding of the stage of the regulations. Once again, I do think it is going to be a tough year for the constructors for Red Bull because of their second driver problem. we haven't seen necessarily any signs that Lawson will be a failure like some of the past second drivers, but even if he is solid, it's going to take Lawson time to get up to speed and get to grips with the team in the car. And there's just some other really excellent driver pairings across the other teams. We've seen in preseason testing that the car looks to be extremely tricky to drive again and doesn't necessarily look particularly quick or maybe the fastest car out there. And because of that, and between their struggles last year, some of the building tension that is in that team, and what we've seen in testing so far, I think that Red Bull have a good shot at being fourth in the constructors this year. In P3, I have Mercedes, and previously I'd predicted that it would be Red Bull, but Mercedes is really a tough one to judge. They really seem to have made a turnaround for this year, for this last year of the regulations. They looked consistent and strong in preseason testing, but there have been many false dawns with Mercedes before, and there is a big caveat of preseason testing, and that's the conditions were generally quite cool at Bahrain, and that has typically suited Mercedes in the past. Australia is going to be a whole nother challenge for them because it is going to be significantly warmer, and that's really going to show if Mercedes have cured some of their problems that we've seen in the past. It's a really crucial year for Mercedes because, like some of these other teams, all of the stuff that they're going to be having this year is going to be going into 2026. If they can't understand these ground effect cars and can't make the changes that they need to, then the struggles are only going to continue in 2026. And even if they do have a strong engine in 2026, the cars are still ground effect, and if they can't get a grip with that, then they're going to be struggling next year in 2026. So overall, I just can't have faith that Mercedes has turned such a corner that they're going to be properly fighting for a championship week in and week out, and fighting for wins week in and week out, but it does seem like they might be making some improvements this year. All right, now for P2 in the Constructors Championship, and I don't even know if I can make a decision here, but for now I'm gonna put it on the books and put it as McLaren in P2. Now, I had previously predicted McLaren in P2, but I feel like that's maybe even more of a bold choice after preseason testing. It just feels like over the course of the season that another team, spoiler alert, Ferrari, might be able to actually pull it off this year. But maybe my biggest reason for still having Ferrari ahead of McLaren is because of the drivers. I just have a bit more faith in the Ferrari duo than I do at McLaren. Not to say that the McLaren duo isn't absolutely fantastic, but I do feel the overall potential of Leclerc and Hamilton is just a bit higher, especially if Hamilton is kind of back to his old self and feeling at one with the car, then that's going to be an extremely formidable duo. But saying all that, I could basically talk myself out of believing that McLaren is going to be second because they just look like they have the best understanding of the car and these regulations right now. They just seem to be on a really good trajectory, and it's hard to bet against them at this point in the season. They've really only made steady progress and positive gains since the end of 2023. And, not even though maybe Leclerc and Hamilton are slightly above Norris and Piastri, they are still the cream of the crop, and they are, right up at the top of the best drivers on the grid right now. Maybe I'm still on some Ferrari and Hamilton copium, but for now, I'm going to lock in McLaren as P2 in the Constructors. So that leads us to P1 in the Constructors Championship, and that is Ferrari, and that's who I had predicted previously as well. Now, while Ferrari did look to be a bit behind McLaren in preseason testing, I still think over the course of the season, with the drivers that they have and the potential that is in that car, I think they are going to be able to bring home the Constructors Championship. The Ferrari, while it did seem a bit inconsistent at times, it did seem to have some really good peaks, and if they can just iron out those peaks and iron out some of those inconsistencies, then they're going to have a really strong car throughout the year. Now, my biggest thing for still having Ferrari winning the Constructors Championship is Lewis Hamilton. It seems like he is doing better than I thought, and it looks like some of his recent struggles with Mercedes might have been down more to the Mercedes car rather than him falling off, but it is still very early days to be making those conclusions. The real key for Ferrari this year to win this championship is to not have any of the stumbles like they did last year, because I really don't see McLaren having any stumbles. While they did struggle at times with some driver calls and whatnot with Norris and Piastri. Generally, they were always on top of things in terms of performance, and they were always thereabouts. They didn't go missing like Ferrari did in the middle of the season. Even though it does look like McLaren might have the edge right now, it is still going to be extremely, extremely close, and the performances of each team are kind of going to vary from, week to week and race to race. Also, something that we really have to keep in mind are the changes to the flexi wings from round 9 and onwards. McLaren has, of course, been at the forefront of these flexi wings, and it seems to be a big performance advantage for them. Now, once this clampdown does happen, this could potentially have some negative effects on McLaren and Mercedes, who are also taking good advantage of it. So how is that going to play into the course of the year, or play into the ending results of the season? Only time will tell, but it's going to be really interesting to see. Ferrari wasn't previously doing as many tricks with the flexi wings, so if there is a negative performance loss from the changing of the flexi wings, then that could really affect McLaren and help Ferrari. One way or another, it is going to be extremely close, and I'm so ready to see what happens this year. Let me know down in the comments below what your guys' thoughts are on my predictions, and let me know what your thoughts or what your predictions are as well. I would love to hear them. If you are interested, give me a follow on social media. I'm on X as Last the First Real, and first spelled F1 RST, and on Instagram as Last the First spelled F1 RST. So thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you all at the Australian Grand Prix.